People of the Way. Throughout the first few centuries of the Piscean Age, people understood Christianity to be a way of life in the present, not as a doctrinal system, esoteric belief, or promise of eternal salvation. By following Jesus' teachings, Christianity changed and improved the lives of many who adhered to this practical spiritual pathway. These early Christians were called people of the way. This way of life defined early Christianity until the Emperor Constantine invited the Church to help rule an empire, and its countercultural lifestyle was replaced by a dogmatic belief system. The zodiac was also known as the Way, and those who understood and practiced astrology were also known as people of the Way. This is what the Lord says: stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that, if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. But who was Jesus? Is there any evidence of a Jesus in the historical record which resembles the biblical Jesus mentioned in the New Testament?
Hello again, and welcome to the first of the Illumination lectures on revisionary theology, placing the biblical story back into the historical record. So we're going to start these lectures with the King Jesus trilogy, which is now a trilogy in 4 parts, as you know. So the 4 parts to this are the books Cleopatra to Christ, which looks at the genealogy of the biblical family and their ancestry, of course. King Jesus, which is quite a thick 600-page book looking at the New Testament, reinterpreting New Testament events based on the history of first century Judea as we know it. Looking especially at the character Saul and Josephus Flavius, and looking at the links between those two, because that's important, because Saul and Josephus were the 2 main historians of this era. Then we go to Jesus, King of Edessa, which is placing Jesus back into the historical record. That's a very interesting book indeed, because it took all of this time before I actually discovered who the biblical Jesus was. So the first 2 books are sort of introductions showing that there are very close links between the biblical story and real history. And then finally, at last, in Jesus, King of Edessa, we find out who the Jesus character really was. And then the 4th one, the extra book in this trilogy, is the Grail Cipher. And that is finding biblical events within Arthurian legend, because as I was going through this story, there were various elements that cropped up that looked very familiar from Arthurian legend. And so it seemed quite clear when I'd finished this story that many elements of Arthurian legend picked up on biblical events. And so we'll look at that as the 4th in this trilogy. And that sort of rewrites a lot of Arthurian legend, which is an interesting story in itself. So we start with Cleopatra to Christ, looking at the links between Egyptian history, the Egyptian royal families, and the biblical royal family. And this is the cover page to the book. This is Cleopatra to Christ, and there is Cleopatra herself. And this trilogy started when I discovered a hidden history within the New Testament texts. Now, when you go to school and college and you do your history and you learn the curriculum that is taught to you, you are effectively learning what the establishment want you to know. There are no real marks for going outside the curriculum. And yet there is a hidden world that exists outside the standard curriculum. So the curriculum is taking you down one road, and what we want to do in this trilogy of books is look at the alternative history, which is visible if you go off that beaten path and go off into some side roads and look at the hidden history that exists, not just within the biblical record, but within real history as well. And I first saw this window into the hidden world in the works of Josephus Flavius, who is probably Judaism's most famous historian, which led me down a deep and dark rabbit hole full of wondrous historical adventures. And the first of these was the discovery of the nativity story within the historical record. And you might think that's impossible to do because this is a strange, fantastical event in the biblical history. And here it is. This is the biblical nativity by Rubens. And well, just look at the imagery here. There's classical architecture there on the left-hand side, crowds of people. We've got camels and horses, fine robes, pomp and circumstance. And we've got the Magi, of course, and they're bringing gold, frankincense, and even myrrh. It's a wonderful, fantastical, unbelievable scene, isn't it? But you've got to remember that within the biblical story, this is the birth of Brian, the carpenter. Does this look like the birth of a poor carpenter? I would say no. And they will say, okay, but yes, but this was the birth of a king, the king of the Jews, because he was called a king both at the nativity, at his birth, and at his crucifixion. He was called a king on 36 occasions within the New Testament. So Jesus was a real king. And of course, theologians and priests will say, oh, no, no, no. He was a carpenter. He was just a poor carpenter. And I'll say, well, the Gospels say he was a king. And they'll say, no, he was just a carpenter. And I'll say, well, why was Herod afraid of a poor carpenter? Such that, he committed the slaughter of the innocents, supposedly. And they will say, well, he was born to be a king. And I'll say, well, so he was a king then? And they'll say, no, 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 he was just a carpenter, just a poor carpenter. And of course, this story, this discussion can go round and round in circles forever. But face facts. The gospel stories indicate that Jesus was a king. And if you look at the paintings throughout the Renaissance era, they also depict Jesus and the biblical family as being royal, with royal robes and royal crowns. So, face facts here. Jesus was a king. But that gives us a problem, because if we are to find this biblical story within the historical record, we need to find a king who was important enough to influence events in the first century, but obscure enough to be lost to history. And the question is, can we find such a king? Is there such a monarchy within the historical record? Well, there is, but you have to look very hard in order to find them. In fact, I had to look for 3 books worth of research before I actually found him, because he has been deleted from the historical record, deliberately deleted. But my 3 books within the King Jesus trilogy will finally name who he is. So where do we start in this research? How do we find the biblical Jesus? Well, we start with real history, with Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. So here they are. And how do we get from Cleopatra to Christ, as the title of my book says? Well, even these monarchs, these rather famous monarchs who you think you might know the history of, even these monarchs have secrets. So let's leave the sugar-coated Gospels behind and enter the real history of first centuries BC and AD, and the complex story of international politics that they hold. And even this was unusual to me, because I thought ancient Roman politics was rather simple, if a little barbaric. You know, if an emperor was disliked, he was done away with. And it was all fairly simple. But it turns out it was a lot more sophisticated than that, with devious plans to ensure the survival and prosperity of the emperor and the empire. So we come to the Ides of March, 44 BC, when Julius Caesar was cut down by his own senators. Momentous event in world history, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But Cleopatra was in Rome at that time, and fearing for her life, she fled. And she fled back to Egypt with her son, Caesarion. But then something rather mysterious happens, because Cicero, who's one of the great historians of this era, said, and I quote here, "I am grieved to hear of Tertia's loss of an expected child, but I should be glad of such a loss in the case of Queen Cleopatra, and that expected scion of the breed of Caesar." Interesting, isn't it? What he's saying is that Cleopatra was pregnant when she fled Rome back to Egypt in 44 BC. But what happened to that child? What happened to that scion or heir to the throne of Rome? We don't know, because that child disappears from history. And this wasn't Caesarion, because Caesarion was already 3 years old by that time. So we have a lacuna here. We have a gap in the history. We don't know what happened to this particular child. But we move on. We move on to the reign of Octavian Augustus. And Octavian kept a whole menagerie of orphan children within the royal palaces in Rome. And one of those, just one of those, quite possibly, might have been this lost child of Queen Cleopatra. Anyway, 20 years later or so, Octavian is consolidating the borders of Rome. And the first thing he does is goes to Mauritania, North Africa. And Mauritania is ruled by an independent monarchy, much the same as they did in Judea with the Herod kings in Judea. Mauritania was run by Yuba II. So to keep Yuba II content and happy, Octavian gives him Cleopatra Selene, who was the daughter of Cleopatra, and Mark Antony. So this minor king of Mauritania, and here he is here, and this is also Cleopatra Selene. So Yuba II was given Cleopatra Selene as his diplomatic bride. It's a method of Rome keeping the various provinces happy vaguely independent, but subservient, of course, to Rome. So with his southern borders now secure, as a client king of Rome, Octavian looks towards his eastern borders, towards Phraates IV of Parthia. And here is Phraates IV. Recognize him? Well, he's the king in your pack of playing cards, of course. And Octavian wanted to placate and have good relations with Phraates IV of Persia, Parthia, because Parthia was the great enemy of Rome. They had already defeated Rome on 2 occasions and taken the military standards. It was a great defeat for Rome. So Octavian couldn't defeat Phraates IV, but he needed to have good diplomatic relations with the king. And so what does he do? Well, Octavian gives Phraates IV a concubine called Thea Musa Aurania. So now we're entering this world of hidden histories, hidden monarchs. Phraates IV, who is he? You've probably not heard of Phraates. But he was one of the line of monarchs of Parthia. But since Western history is not really concerned so much with Parthia, you don't tend to hear of these monarchs very much. And then we come to his new concubine, Thea Musa Aurania. And I'm sure you've probably not heard of her because her history is more troubling, especially to biblical history. And effectively, she has been largely deleted from history. In fact, the quotes we have about Thea Musa from Josephus Flavius were thought to be fictional until her coins started turning up all across the Parthian East. Now, this gives us a little bit of a problem because this history is saying to us that Yuba II, who's the minor monarch of North Africa, well, he got an Egyptian princess and goddess, a daughter of Cleopatra VII, no less. But Phraates IV, the great king of Parthia and Persia, well, he gets a concubine, Thea Musa Aurania. It doesn't really make sense, does it? Because if Phraates IV had been given a mere concubine, he would have declared war on Rome. But he didn't. Phraates was so pleased with his new concubine that he made her his chief wife, the queen of all Parthia. So what are we to make of this? Why did this happen? And the answer is most probably, and I think myself quite definitely, that this Queen Thea Musa Aurania was actually the lost daughter, the other daughter of Queen Cleopatra VII, the daughter she had with Julius Caesar. And in the book, I go through many reasons why I think this is so. But perhaps the best of the reasons is that they look very much the same. So here's Cleopatra on the left and Thea Musa Aurania of Parthia on the right. Are they not the same? Look at the small mouth and the slightly receding chin. Are they not mother and daughter? If so, that will explain a great deal, because Thea Musa Aurania was no concubine. She was a princess, descended from Queen Cleopatra, and therefore descended from the monarchies of Egypt, Macedonia, Rome, Parthia, and of Israel as well. And you might say, of Israel? Where does Israel fit into this? Well, the Egyptian Testament series, which we're going to go through later, places the Israelites back into Egypt and says that they were Egyptians themselves. And so this Egyptian royal line became an Egypto Judaic royal line. And so there was an element of Judaism within this Egyptian royal line as well, because the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, as we will see in a later lecture. So, how is this connected with the biblical story? We've been looking at the history of Parthia here. How is this linked with the New Testament story? Well, this royal family didn't actually stay in Parthia for very, very long. They were only the king and queen of Parthia for just 6 years. And Josephus Flavius tells us the history of this, of how they departed from Parthia. And Josephus Flavius says, at first, Phraates treated Theomusa as a concubine, but after she had a son named Phraates, he declared her his lawful wife and held her in great honour. Phraates, that's the son, considered it a dangerous and tedious thing to have power handed over by his father, so he plotted with the assistance of his mother to do away with his father. There is also a story that he had sexual relations with his mother, and he was detested for both reasons and embroiled in a civil war before he had gathered much strength and driven from the throne. So here we have Queen Theomusa Orania of Parthia and her son, Phraates, being driven out of Parthia, driven into exile. So they didn't actually stay there very long. They had to go elsewhere. But where did they go to? Well, Josephus Flavius picks up the story again. And the Roman historians confirm this story as well as to where they went to. But Josephus Flavius says, when Herod understood that there was a man who was a Jew who had come out of Babylon with 500 horsemen and 100 of his relations, and had passed over the Euphrates and now abode in Antioch, he sent for this man and promised to give him land, tax-free. And this is part of the same story. It's not explicitly said that it's the same story, but the Roman historians confirm that this is where they went to. So Theomusa Orania and Phraates, her son, ended up in Syria. And Herod, this is one of the Herod tetrarchs, because this would have been 84 about. So this would have been Herod Archelaus, perhaps, sent for this royal family and promised them to have land in the east of his domains free of tax. And those lands ended up on the eastern borders of Syria, the eastern borders of Judea. And the idea was that if Herod gave this royal family some land towards the east of their lands, they could act as a buffer region between themselves and the Parthian monarchy, which they did for about 200, 300 years. So that was the idea of giving them lands towards the east of his realm. So what Josephus Flavius is saying here is correct. He calls them Babylonian Jews. And yes, they were Babylonian because they came out of Parthia, which is Old Babylon. And yes, they were Jews because, as we saw before, they were partially Jewish through their ancestry, but also these particular people were initiated into Nazarene Judaism in the AD 50s. So yes, indeed, they did indeed become Jews, and we have this from the Talmud itself, tells us this is so. And so we get these titles that Josephus uses throughout all of his books. He's always referring to people who are Babylonian Jews and to our countrymen beyond the Euphrates. And these are the people he's talking about. He's talking about Theomusa Orania and Phraates after they'd come out of Parthia and they had settled in a place that was on the borders of the Euphrates. And the Antioch he refers to in these stories here turns out not to be Antiochos, but he's actually referring to Antioch Edessa, which is just beyond the Euphrates. The problem being that Josephus mentions Antioch on several occasions, and so do the biblical texts. But there were 16 different cities called Antioch in this era. They were named by the Seleucus, the king of the Seleucid Empire, who named them after his father, and his father was called Antiochus, of course. So we don't always know quite which Antioch that the biblical story and Josephus is actually referring to. And in this occasion, he was referring to Antioch Edessa, which lies in northern Syria, just across the Euphrates. So we have this story of the exile of Theomusa Aurania. But is this not the story of the biblical nativity? Is it not one and the same? So, well, what is the biblical nativity? Well, it's a story about a royal family. We've already said that Jesus is royal. He's called a king on 36 occasions within the New Testament. They are on a journey, for some reason, in Syrio-Judea, something to do with taxation, and they have nowhere to stay, so they have to lodge in a stable. And then they are visited by the Magi, the three Magi. And here they are, the three Magi that come to visit the infant Jesus, wearing their Phrygian caps, as you can see, which is quite typical for this era and region. But why would the Magi come to see a carpenter in Judea? The Magi were the priesthood of Parthia, of course, of Persia. Why would they come to see the birth of a mere carpenter? While we're at it, have a look at the Phrygian caps there. They're all wearing Phrygian caps. I have lots of these asides in these books where I just branch off for a while and try to show how this is relevant to modern history. And this little detail is relevant because this Phrygian cap is also worn by the French Marianne. And here is the French Marianne. She is the symbol of France. But look at her headdress. She is wearing a red Phrygian cap, exactly the same as was worn in this era and this region, and by the Magi that came to visit the biblical Jesus. And it was a red cap, of course, even in modern France, because here it is. This is three ladies wearing the red cap of Marianne, the symbol of France. And it's the same symbol as worn by the three Magi 2,000 years ago. This history revolves around all of Western European history throughout the last 2,000 years. And this is just one small instance of that. So this exile story is the same as the nativity story. So we've already seen what the nativity story is, so let's have a look at the exile of Queen Theomusa Aurania and Phraatesses. What was this story in essence? Well, it was the exile of a royal family, Queen Theomusa Aurania and King Phraatesses. They were on a journey because they were exiled from Parthia and they went to Syria. They were in Syrio-Judea because they became the queen and king of Syrio-Judea as well. This was something to do with taxation, and I'll show later that this was a big tax dispute with Rome. They had to lodge in a stable. Well, we don't know exactly where they lodged, but when they came into Syria, they did have nowhere to stay. There was no palace, so they had to find some accommodation. And they would have been visited by the Parthian Magi. Remember, these were the king and queen of Persia, Parthia. They had just been exiled from Parthia, but any son born to them would have been a potential prince and king of Parthia. So of course the Persian Magi would have come to the birth of this important prince, because he was a potential king of Parthia. And that explains the visit by the Magi to the birth of Jesus. They didn't come to see some small, minor, poor carpenter who was born in Judea. They came to see the birth of a potential prince of all of Parthia. So the story begins to make a little bit of sense now, whereas it made no sense before. And it only makes sense if we realize who Jesus was, that he was a royal prince, a prince of both Egypt and of Parthia, who was living at that time in Syria. And this also may explain the reason why Jesus' father disappears from the story so quickly. Because if we look at this from a historical perspective, who would have been the parents of this potential child that was just born to these royals in exile? Well, the potential parents would have been King Phraates and Queen Aurania, who were son and mother. Or it could have been Phraates and Queen Helena, who would have been brother and sister. So potentially we have incest here, but of course incest was quite normal within these royal families in this era. Akhenaten, well, he married 2 of his daughters, perhaps even 3. Cleopatra, well, she married 2 of her brothers. Even Agrippa II, who was a king of essentially Judea, king of Israel, was effectively married to his sister Berenice. So Jesus, born of an incestuous marriage. Well, we've just opened up a Pandora's box of troubles for the biblical scribes. So would they have covered this up? Well, yes, you bet they would. But had there been such a marriage and such a birth and such a cover-up of an incestuous marriage, this would induce distortions within the story, and we will see these distortions time and time again. It involves distortions as to who these people were, their status, well, the fact that they were royal, and we've already seen that they most probably were royal, and also the date. We for various reasons, we get a shift in the timeline. The date starts to migrate slightly. We have what becomes known as the chronological chasm. Another thing we have to consider is that Jesus was of Egyptian ancestry, and this is another thing that is being covered up within this story. And we know that Jesus had an Egyptian ancestry because the gospel texts tell us. Jesus went into Egypt for his education. It says so in Matthew 2:13. And then it says of the same event, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Matthew 2:15. So Jesus was closely connected with Egypt. He went to Egypt for his education. And the biblical text also called Jesus an Egyptian within Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel stories themselves. And, well, to see this, we have to look at a verse where an army commander is addressing Saul. This is St. Paul. And he says to Saul, "Are you not the Egyptian who made an uproar and led 4,000 men out into the wilderness?" So he is identifying, this verse is identifying the person who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness as the Egyptian. And yet we know that the person who took the 4,000 or 5,000 out into the wilderness was Jesus himself. It says so in Mark 6:31 and in Mark 8:1 as well. And yet this verse in Acts is identifying this person as the Egyptian, and we'll see that this person was the Egyptian false prophet. And this is a verse in Acts, it's 21:38. So Acts of the Apostles is identifying Jesus as the Egyptian false prophet. And this not only shows us that Jesus had an Egyptian ancestry, it gives us a lot of extra details, because we know quite a lot about this Egyptian false prophet from the works of Josephus Flavius. And so if we know that Jesus was the Egyptian false prophet, we have a lot of extra information about this particular character, this particular king. And we get this from Josephus Flavius in his Jewish War, where he gives us an alternative account of the Mount of Olives incident, which you probably remember from the Gospel story, where Jesus was on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and they are surprised by the Roman guard, and he is taken he's arrested and taken to prison. So this is the story of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. And here is the Mount of Olives. And this is literally, it's just outside the old city of Jerusalem, just across from the Kidron Valley. We have this mount, which is, well, it's called the Mount of Olives, but it's mostly a graveyard. There's this enormous great cemetery on the top here. And from this image, the old city is to the left. So if you look to the left of this image, you see the base of the Temple Mount, the old city of Jerusalem. Anyway, this is where Jesus went to with his disciples before he was captured by the Roman guard. But we know that the Egyptian false prophet also went there, because Josephus Flavius tells us so. So Josephus says of this incident, "There came out of Egypt at about this time a prophet," this is the Egyptian false prophet, "and advised the multitude to go with him to the Mount of Olives." Sound familiar? But this is the Egyptian false prophet organizing a rebellion from the Mount of Olives, an armed assault on the city of Jerusalem. So it has a slightly different emphasis in this particular story. Now in the Gospels we have the same story, although it's got more sugar coating on it, of course. In the Gospels it says, "Jesus said unto them, He that has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. And they said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him." And that's Luke 22:38. Now this is important because immediately before the meeting on the Mount of Olives, it says that Jesus used his wallet and selling garments to go and buy swords. So the disciples were armed on the Mount of Olives. And we know this because someone got their ear chopped off later. So we have 2 descriptions of the same event, surely. 2 armed gatherings on the Mount of Olives in the 1st century. But Josephus goes on with his story, and he says, now the Egyptian false prophet, now Josephus is calling this person the Egyptian false prophet all the way through this, and we've already identified the Egyptian false prophet with the biblical Jesus. So Josephus says, the Egyptian false prophet said, he would show them how the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would gain an entrance to the city through those walls when they had fallen down. Well, this has a parallel in the following verses from the Gospels, because Jesus says, And when Jesus came near to Jerusalem, he wept over it, saying, "The days will come upon you when your enemies," he's talking to Jerusalem here, "the days will come upon you when your enemies will cast a trench about you and compass thee around and keep you penned in on every side. And they will flatten you level with the ground, and they will not leave one stone upon another." That's Luke 19:43. So Jesus is saying exactly the same thing, that the walls of Jerusalem will come tumbling down. It's the same speech by the same person on the same location, on the Mount of Olives. And it goes on, because as we know from the biblical story, he was captured. So Josephus says of this event, and remember Josephus is talking about the Egyptian false prophet. Josephus says, "Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to attack the Egyptian. And he, Felix, slaughtered 400 of them and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight." And in a very similar fashion, the Gospels say, "Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests, came with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote off the ear of the high priest's servant." That's taken from John 18:3. So in the gospel story, it was a band of men who came to arrest Jesus on the Mount of Olives. And a band of men, well, in the Greek, in the original Greek for this gospel, it actually says a spira. And a spira is a cohort, 600 armed Roman soldiers. So this is the same as the story given by Josephus, where he said a band of soldiers went to arrest the Egyptian false prophet on the Mount of Olives. It's the same event. Now this is awkward. It causes some problems, because it indicates to us that a lot of the events in the Gospel of Luke came from Josephus Flavius, from his Jewish war. Now, this shows a great link here between the Gospel events and the works of Josephus Flavius. And this is why theologians will often say that the Gospel stories weren't written until AD 70. But they won't explain exactly why they think that. But the reason they think that is because a lot of the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles comes from the works of Josephus Flavius, which wasn't written down until AD 72. So if the Gospels are copying Josephus Flavius, they must have been written after the AD 70s. It also tells us that Jesus had an Egyptian heritage, as we've just seen, that he was the Egyptian false prophet. And that's what we've seen in this links to the royal family of Queen Theomusa Aurania and her links back to Queen Cleopatra. It also means that Jesus was involved in some sort of revolt in Judea. But we know this because the Gospels tell us that. If you look at Mark 15:7, it says that Jesus was jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. But which revolution was this? Which revolt was this within real history? Well, as we will see in this, but also in later research, we will see that this identifies the result as being the AD 66 to AD 70 Jewish revolt, because here it mentions Felix. Felix was the governor of Judea from 52 to AD 60. So this was the late AD 50s. This was not the AD 30s. And the revolt that Jesus was involved in, this is Jesus, the Egyptian false prophet, was the Jewish revolt of AD 66. So this gives us what will become known as in these works as the chronological chasm, because there is a discontinuity between the dates given in the gospel texts and the dates given in the historical texts for identical events. And here's one of those identical events, the armed attack from the Mount of Olives, which the Gospels are making out happened in the AD 30s, but in reality happened in the late AD 50s. And we know this because the governor was Felix. So we have this chronological chasm that is starting to open up within these texts. And one of the best illustrations of this comes from Lena Einhorn, who, following my research, because I wrote about this more than 20 years ago, following my research, she has picked up on that research and she has made a graphical representation of the similar events that occur within the biblical record and within the historical record. And here is that graphical representation. And you can probably see she's nicely coloured these with similar colours. Two groups of similar events. The one on the left, the upper one, comes from the New Testament. The lower one on the right comes from Josephus. And you can see there's a whole series there of similar events that occur on different dates. Now, did we really have two very, very similar groups of events like this happening? Or is one of these false? Well, in reality, one of these is false. And this is the chronological chasm, the chasm between real history and the events as given to us by the biblical texts. And you can see one of those events here is the one we've just talked about, which is the Mount of Olives event. So the event that's circled there in red is we have the Jesus on the Mount of Olives event. And then if you look on the bottom right, we have the same event in real history, which is when it really occurred in the AD 50s. And that's when it really did actually happen. So we have this chronological chasm. And why did this happen? Why do we have this separation between real history and biblical history in their chronology? Well, this actually was deliberate because they wanted to separate the biblical events from the tumultuous events of the Jewish revolt. And they seem to have done that very effectively because everybody believes that the biblical events happened in the AD 30s with Pontius Pilate. But the mention of Pontius Pilate is about the only event we can date to the AD 30s. And as we go through these biblical events, time and time again, we'll see event after event, which is actually connected with the AD 50s and the AD 60s. And Lena Einhorn has graphically illustrated that in this graph, where you can see that the majority of the events she has listed actually occurred in the 50s and 60s. And we'll go through a lot of other events that Einhorn doesn't even look at, which again show us that the gospel events happened in the AD 50s and 60s. So, in summary, this is the beginning of the King Jesus trilogy. And what have we seen from the information that we've looked at so far? Well, first of all, the nativity story is very, very similar to the exile of Queen Theomusa Aurania and Phraatesses from Parthia, where they ended up in Judeo-Syria, Judeo-Syria. It is a very, very similar story. And that means that Jesus has some Egyptian heritage within his ancestry. But we've also seen that Jesus was known as the Egyptian false prophet, which again tells us that Jesus in this day, in this era, was known as an Egyptian. We also now can see that Jesus led a revolt. It turned out to be a revolt against Rome. We will see more about this later. But he was the leader of a revolt. And this was probably the Jewish revolt of the AD 60s. That there has been a cover-up of this revolt, resulting in this chronological chasm between the AD 60s and the AD 30s. A chasm that pervades all of Judean history, both biblical and historical, because anyone that was writing about the first century events was confused by the biblical chronology, because if they wanted to link anything into biblical events, they had to do it in the AD 30s, not in the AD 60s. And this has coloured a lot of the stories and a lot of the history that's come out of Judea from the first century. And even Josephus has a lot of this within his accounts as well. So we have this chronological chasm that occurs throughout the biblical history. So those are the main topics of Cleopatra to Christ. And from this, we're going to look in the next lecture on the King Jesus trilogy. We're going to look at some of the beliefs of this sect of Jesus and demonstrate how they are not quite the same type of beliefs as you would imagine would come from first century Judea. In fact, the central component of the Nazarene theology, the Church of Jesus and James, was actually the zodiac. And so that's the topic for part 2 in this lecture series. Well, that's the end of this lecture. Next time we'll be looking at the theology and the beliefs of the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James, and demonstrate that it was not quite what you might imagine for a church in Judea in the first century AD. Because the central veneration and symbolism of the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James was the zodiac. And we'll look at that interesting topic in the next lecture.
Prior to the time of Jesus and the Roman Empire, the earliest monotheistic religion began in Persia around 1000 BC. This religion, known as Zoroastrianism, combines a dualistic cosmology of good and evil with eschatological predictions of the ultimate triumph of the Ahura Mazda, Lord Wisdom, or the Logos over evil. Dualistic cosmology is a moral or spiritual belief that two fundamental concepts exist which often oppose one another. Dating back to the Avestan period 1500 BC to 650 AD, it served as the official religion of the Iranian empires. It came to an end with the Muslim conquest of Persia. Many fled to the Indian subcontinent, where around 100,000 remain today. Zoroaster sees the human condition as a mental struggle between Asa, the Logos, truth, right order, and right working, and Drudge, a female demon of corpse matter or hell. And the purpose of humankind is to sustain and align itself to Asa, Ahura Mazda, the Logos. This occurs through active ethical participation in life and the exercise of constructive, good thoughts, words, and deeds. This Zoroastrian philosophy influenced Judaism and Platonism, and was also a key element in classic Greek philosophy, influencing Pythagoras with terms such as love and wisdom to describe the search for ultimate truth. Zoroaster emphasized the freedom of the individual to choose right and wrong, and individual responsibility for one's deeds. This personal choice to accept Asa, the Logos, and shun Drudge, the evil counterpart, is one's own decision, and not a dictate of Asa, Ahura Mazda. By thinking good thoughts, saying good words, and doing good deeds, one increases Asa in the world and in themselves, celebrating the divine order and coming a step closer on the everlasting road to Frashokaret, the final renovation of the universe, when evil will be destroyed and everything else will be then in perfect unity with God. Mankind are not the slaves or servants of Ahura Mazda, but can make personal choices to be co-workers, thereby perfecting the world. The Persian contribution to early astronomy and astrology should not be underestimated. At the time of Persian history, from the last decade of the 5th century BC until Alexander's conquest, was the most fertile period of Babylonian mathematical astronomy. There is an abundance of Persian astrology which has only recently been translated into English. It is also important to understand that astronomy and its companion applied science of astrology were central features of the intellectual landscape of the early Islamic period. Bundahism is the name traditionally given to an encyclopedic collection of Zoroastrian cosmogony and cosmology written in Pahlavi. The Bundahism states, Ormuz created the luminaries between the sky and the earth, the stars of the constellations, and also those which were not of the constellations, then the moon and the sun. As he first created the firmament, the stars and the constellations were fixed thereon, especially these 12 whose names are the ram, the cow, the twins, crab, lion, husk of corn, balance, scorpion, centaur, goat, pot, and fishes. He ordained this firmament in the semblance of a year, the 12 constellations, like 12 months, every constellation having 30 degrees, just as every month has 30 days. This brief introduction offers an insight into the Zoroastrians' understanding of the cosmos, astronomy, and astrology. You could say that these were the original people of the way. This Zoroastrian philosophy influenced Judaism and Platonism, and was also a key element in classic Greek philosophy, educating the Greeks, starting with Pythagoras, with terms such as love and wisdom to describe the search for ultimate truth.
Welcome back to the Illumination Lectures by myself, Ralph Ellis. Again, extracted on this occasion from the book Cleopatra to Christ, which is the first in the King Jesus trilogy. Last time we looked at the ancestry of the biblical family and discovered that they have a sort of an Egyptian and Parthian heritage, mixed with some Roman, Greek, and a bit of Israelite ancestry as well. And that makes for a very, very well connected and powerful royal family, of course, but perhaps a confusing belief system. And we'll continue looking at that religious confusion today, because today we're looking at Jewish zodiacs. So, did you know that the primary symbol of early Judaism was the zodiac? And if not, why not? We were talking much earlier about the role of academia and how they don't necessarily tell the full truth in their education and their television series. I call it lying by omission, because they don't exactly say something doesn't exist, but they forget to mention it, and therefore the wider public don't know anything about it. And here is one of those topics, the zodiac. Who knows that the primary symbol of ancient Judaism was the zodiac? So here is one of those zodiacs. This is the Beth Alpha zodiac at Bet Shean, which is just to the south of Lake Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And okay, it's a little bit naive in its simplicity, but nevertheless it is a zodiac. It has Helios, the sun god, in the center, drawn by a chariot with 4 horses. It has the 12 signs of the zodiac around the perimeter. And then in each corner we have the symbol of each season. The signs of the zodiac are named. You can see the names there on each constellation. And the names are actually the names of the month. So within Judaism, obviously, the month name was the constellation name. It's rather like us calling December Sagittarius or something of that nature. Okay, so that's an interesting zodiac, but quite simplistic, you might say. But the next one we're going to look at is the Sephoris zodiac. And here it is. And this is to the southwest of Galilee, just to the west of the Beth Alpha zodiac that we just looked at. And this is a much nicer zodiac, as you can see. So it's about 8 meters wide. It's quite large, actually. It has Helios, the sun, on his chariot in the center. It's orientated slightly to the left, so you'll have to sort of look a little bit sideways on there. The horses are at the right-hand side, and the head of Helios is on the left-hand side as you look at it. Surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac, and we have the months again in each corner. So the layout is the same as the Beth Alpha zodiac, but this is just a much finer zodiac. Look at the craftsmanship on this one. It's probably one of the best mosaics from this early era. It's just a shame that it's being damaged quite so much. But, you know, it's been in the ground for 2,000 years, and no doubt people have looted a lot of the stones for use elsewhere. Just below this, you can't see it in this particular image, there's a dedication to someone who actually, you know, paid for this zodiac. And the dedication says, "May he be remembered for being good. Udan, the son of Isaac, the priest, and Pagari, his daughter. Amen, amen." So, yes, we know these are Jewish zodiacs because just out of scene, you can't see it on here, but we have the other accoutrements and symbols of Judaism. So there is the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the menorah candelabra, the shofar horn. All of the symbols of Judaism are here on this zodiac. Nevertheless, we have a zodiac in the center, which is, you might think, rather unusual for Judaism, because you don't see zodiacs within modern Judaism. So perhaps we should qualify this by saying that this was a symbol of Nazarene Judaism, or perhaps Galilean Judaism, rather than Orthodox Judaism. We tend to think of Judaism as a single religion, but of course in this era, we're talking, between the 1st and the 4th centuries, there were many different sects of Judaism. Josephus mentions at least 4. He has the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essene, and what he calls the 4th sect of Judaism, which is not mentioned very much. And he doesn't actually name who they are, but we can guess that the 4th sect are actually the Nazarene, who are mentioned in the Gospels, and they're mentioned in the Old Testament, and the Galileans. In fact, both of those are mentioned in the New Testament, but they're sort of obliquely mentioned. It's not obvious that there are 2 extra sects of Judaism, but they are intimately connected with the Gospel story, because Jesus was called a Nazarene in Matthew 2:23. And the Nazarenes were Egypto-Israelites. Remember in the last lecture we heard that the biblical family were linked into Egypt, and Jesus went to his education into Egypt. And therefore the Nazarene Judaism has a sort of Egyptian sort of flavor to it. And in addition to that, of course, all of the Israelites were linked to Egypt. They came out of Egypt. That's where they came from on their exodus. And Josephus Flavius actually says that the Israelites were the Hyksos Egyptians themselves. And we'll look at that in a later lecture. And it's just quite obvious that 1 or 2 sects within Judaism, within the 1st century, had kept some of these Egyptian beliefs, and therefore we have this veneration of the zodiac. But even then, you might say that the depiction is fairly odd, because look at this zodiac again. The central depiction is of, well, let's look at the general zodiac to start with. And it's full of idolatrous images. And this goes against the primary tenet of Judaism. I think it's the 2nd of the 10 commandments. You must not make any graven images. And here we see 12 plus the center plus the corners. So we've got, how many is that? We've got 17 idolatrous images on this zodiac, plus all of the images that are slightly off this image and you can't see them. So the zodiac is heretical in itself, because it contains all of these idolatrous images. And then we have Helios at the center, the Greek sun god. Now, why would we have a Greek sun god on a Judaic zodiac? Well, he's not very visible on that one, is he? So let's have a look at the next zodiac, which is the zodiac at Hamat Tavera. And here it is. And you can probably see the zodiac a little more clearly here. So this is Hamat Tavera. It's a zodiac on the Sea of Galilee itself, just below Tiberias. So again, in the Galilee area, it's obviously a favorite region for having this sort of symbolism within Judaism. And there we see Helios in the center. Again, surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac and the seasons in each corner. But why Helios, the Greek sun god, in the center? It seems a bit incongruous, really. Well, really, bearing in mind the Egyptian heritage of this royal family, this biblical royal family, it should really be the the Egyptian flying sun disk in the center, the image of the Egyptian sun, the flying sun disk. And we're going to see lots of those later because they do appear a lot within Judaism and within Christianity as well. In fact, it's one of the primary symbols of Christianity, if you know what you're looking for. But this is Greek. But remember that this family came out, we saw in the last lecture, this family came out of Parthia, Persia. And the Greeks had conquered Parthia back in the 3rd century BC with the campaigns of Alexander the Great. And so this family are just using the Greek imagery that they're probably familiar with, the imagery that came out of Parthia. And remember that most of Syria and Judea was half Greek anyway, because of the again the campaigns of Alexander and the Seleucid Empire that controlled that region was Greek. And so they've merely used the Greek imagery for the sun god.
The fate of a human being is influenced by his mazal, the astrological constellation of the stars when he has been born. From Idra Zeta, Kabbalistic work, typically printed as part of the Jewish Zohar. Yehoshua ben Levi was reported to have said about anyone who knows how to calculate astronomical seasons and the movement of constellations and does not do so, they do not take notice of the work of God, and they do not see his handiwork. In several places in the Talmud it states that every man has an astrological influence, mazal, with a particular star which is his patron from conception and birth, and which perceives things unknown to the man himself. Two people born under the same star are also said to have a bodily and spiritual kinship. Judah Halevi was a Sephardic Jewish poet, physician and philosopher of the 11th century. He acknowledges in his magnus opus, the Kuzari, that the celestial bodies have an influence on earthly affairs, but does not admit that the astrologers have the ability to determine the mode of operation of the star system on human beings and other living creatures in this terrestrial world.